Hello, Joris. Welcome to World Cuisine of Private Kitchen. We are very honored to have you. And I would like to start off with asking you to introduce yourself. Maybe you can tell a bit about your background, what you've been doing so far. And of course, a lot of our audience will know you already, but it's still nice to hear from yourself, to hear a story about yourself.
Sure. My name is Joris de Man. I'm a composer and a sound designer, mainly working in video games, but also a little bit in film and animation. Been working in this industry for about 25 to 30 years. So really started quite early when there really wasn't any kind of games industry to speak of, especially in Holland. So that's sort of where I started. Messing around with Ataris, so I'm sure you remember the time when the Atari ST came out,
Yes.
made a massive impact on music production. But at the time, I was more interested in the actual internal sound chip. So the sound chip that Cubase used for its, click track is one I actually used to start creating music with, and I was actually much more interested in that. I came from quite a musical family, so my dad's Roderick de Man. He's I think a fairly well known, at least in Holland, contemporary composer. My brother's Martijn de Man, who's used to be a keyboard player in various bands and now is a sort of media composer himself. And my late mother is Annelie de Man, who's used to be a harpsichord player, but more in the contemporary repertoire than the sort of classical. So, and they were both teachers as well. So my dad taught at the conservatory, so he was counterpoint and composition. My mom used to teach at the Muziekschool in Utrecht, or the conservatory in Utrecht, if I say that correctly. And so the whole family was sort of into music, and I was the youngest one. My brother's 3 years older than me. And everybody was doing music. So growing up, I was almost sort of a bit rebellious and thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't do music because everybody else is, and I should try something different. And I got really interested into computers and tinkering with things. I played a little bit of violin growing up, and I used to play in a school orchestra because I went to the gymnasium in Den Haag, in The Hague, for a few years, and I played in the school orchestra there, and so I got a little bit of sort of orchestral experience there, but it wasn't really a great fit. I played violin for about 6, 7 years, and then I realized, well, there's no way I'm ever going to score any girls that way. So my brother and I started a band, and we started, sort of playing in bands, and I played a little bit of drums and some synthesizer. But I very quickly realized that was really more his bag than mine. He was a good musician. He could play, really well, and I wasn't. I wasn't a great player. I didn't really have a feel for it. But what I did notice is that editing things and being able to capture MIDI and playing it in and then editing it was something that I was very interested in. The fact that you could go into studio, and that's some of the stuff I saw through him. He was in a band that got signed to Sony, a band called Heroes for Sale, and they were recording some demos, and I went along just to see how that went, and then sort of saw the studio in action and thought, wow, this is interesting. I really like this. I'm not, I'm not interested in being on stage. I'm not a great musician. I don't have that sort of performing spirit that a lot of people have. But I like being in the background and tinkering with things, and so that's kind of where it started, I guess, in a way.
A really musical background. I can imagine that you want to rebel a bit in the beginning, but as you see, you ended up also in music. We all know you, of course, about the games, particularly in the Netherlands, from Guerilla Games. You started already quite early working with them. Is there any specific to tell about, for example, the last one? I understood you scored also the trailer for the very last version.
Yeah, so Guerilla Games has got quite a long history in Holland, and I don't know if it's useful for me to tell a little bit about that, because the way Guerilla Games itself came about is quite interesting. There used to be a sort of quite a big media company in Holland that started doing out websites when the internet was new, if you will, and everybody wanted a website. Some people didn't even know what it was, and when that all started out, if you were able to create websites, you were like the king, because no one else really knew how to do that. And that's how a company called Lost Boys in Amsterdam started out, by providing websites for big companies and big sort of multinationals. And they thought it might be fun to do some games as well. And so they had a little games division. And initially it was really small. There was one division doing a little bit of sort of early PlayStation console stuff, and there was another division doing little handheld Game Boy things. And it wasn't really going anywhere fast. I mean, they had some things in production. The first game they released wasn't particularly successful, but they managed to pull it off. And in Holland in general, there wasn't really that much going on. And one of the managers sort of noticed that and said, well, there's some other companies dotted around Holland that are also working on their own various things. And so what about if we just take 2 or 3 really talented ones and put them together as one company, sort of make a crack team of like the best that Holland's got to offer, and try and do something with that. And that's essentially how Guerilla was born. They put those people together. Some people were lost along the way, and they said, well, we're going to develop 3 game ideas, 3 completely different games. And what usually happens in game development is that you kind of do a pitch, so you create not the whole game, but you create like a small snippet that sort of captures the essence of what the game is about. And so there were 3 games. There was one, a first-person shooter called Marines. There was another called Knights, which was like a platform sort of Mario-type game. And there was a third one called Steel Whisper, and later changed its name. And that was sort of a third-person Metal Gear Solid type game. And they basically started shopping these around just to see if any publishers would be interested in that. And as they were doing that, I worked a couple of years in the UK, because initially when I started, there wasn't really any place to work. So I moved to the UK, worked for a game developer called Bitmap Brothers, which was at the time sort of in the Atari Amiga time. They were a fairly big deal, and kind of then disappeared a little bit. But I built up some experience there, and then came back to Holland after 3 years, and Guerilla sort of seemed to be the logical choice to go to. And so as they were shopping these games around, I said, well, if we really want to sell those games and the quality, then perhaps we should record something with an orchestra, because that will really elevate the quality. And I was kind of bullshitting a little bit, really, but I thought I could pull this off. And I just read this article about this other composer in the States that had gone to Moscow and recorded with an orchestra there. And he said, it's great in Moscow because they're fairly cheap. You pay an all-in price and you get everything. You get the hall, you get the players, they do the mixing, and you just come back with a fully recorded piece. And I thought, well, we could do that. I didn't really have a clue, but and so that's sort of how it started. And I did those recordings, and one of the games struck a chord with Sony, which was the Marines game, the first-person shooter, because at the time Halo was about to come out for the Xbox, and PlayStation was kind of trying to position itself and said, well, we need something like that, because obviously people are really liking a good first-person shooter at the moment, so we need sort of a counter to that. And so they've been looking around at different developers. Has anyone got anything that can stand up to the almighty Halo? And they thought that perhaps this could be it. And that title became Killzone, which is the first Killzone that Guerilla Games did.
Must be from that explosion we saw earlier. Is that the same shit we got from the Arc Tower?
Looks like it. Wonder where this shit is coming from.
We should tell Evelyn when we get a chance.
was right. We're fucked either way. But when has that stopped us before? All right, let's take it to them.
And the soundtrack sort of helped a little bit in trying to elevate some of the quality there of the game, or at least how it's perceived. And that sort of became a franchise. And so at the time, I was working for Guerilla Games, and I worked for them I was in-house for about 7 years. But then things started shifting. I'd done a workshop in Los Angeles because I was also very interested in film scoring. So I did the ASCAP film scoring workshop in 2005, and I really enjoyed the experience. It was pretty hardcore because they really do throw you in the deep end. So they say, here's a clip of film. You got a couple of weeks. You got to come up with the score. You got to write the picture. You got to do the orchestrations, and you got to conduct as well. And I'm not classically trained, so I had and I don't even remember this because I think I had you as a teacher, but I had a very, very brief stint at the Hogeschool van de Kunsten in Utrecht. So I studied there for I think it was there between 6 and 8 months. And that's when all this game stuff started happening, because I'd started this course, and it was, I thought it could be appropriate, but I started getting some of this game work, and I thought, well, maybe I'll do a year's sabbatical and I'll just do some of this game stuff, because in essence, that's already doing what I want to do after this course, but I can do it now. And maybe after a year, I'll come back and finish off my course. And of course, that never happened. So.
No, that's what you see a lot of. Sometimes you see that with a lot of people. It's a way to learn simply in practice. But interesting story, how things can develop from scratch, you might say, and then grow into this. You were also talking to me beforehand about another game. It was called Velocity. Can you tell us something about it? Maybe you can also have a look at the clip later on.
Yes, absolutely. So next to sort of some of the bigger projects, because obviously these projects like Killzone and Horizon, they're sort of mammoth projects that take a long time to develop. So sometimes it can be quite refreshing and also necessary as a composer to do other projects on the side, because sometimes these projects can't necessarily sustain you financially for the full duration. That's not always true for every project, but in some instances you kind of have to. Or if you're in between projects, it's really good to also look at other projects. And so Velocity was developed by an indie developer here in Brighton, who was very keen on developing sort of a fast-paced retro shooter. So almost like the old arcade games, the Japanese arcade games that you used to play. So sort of a top-down shooter game where it's all very quick and very intense, and you kind of have these short bursts of really intense gameplay. And visually also it looked very sort of retro modern. So on one hand, sort of a very 80s look, with lots sort of neon glows and things like that, but at the same time with a very modern slant on it. The director of this game, James Marsden, was also a bit of a bedroom producer himself. So the first game I came onto was essentially almost like a production job, because he said, listen, I've got this game and I've got these 4 tracks, and I'm not really a composer, but I'm sort of more like a producer, and I made these tracks, but they don't quite sound right. I haven't quite got the production skills to really put these in the game. So would you mind sort of doing a production job on them? And so I did that on the first game. I essentially took his tracks, just got a bunch of stems, and played a whole load of things on top of it to sort of beef it up and make it sound, big and impressive. And he really enjoyed it. So he said, well, on the second game, let's actually do it together. So you write a bunch of tracks, I'll write a couple of tracks. You do the same thing, you produce it, but we all sort of make it sound as if it's all coming from the same universe. And that became Velocity 2X. which if people are interested, you can check out on Spotify as well. And that was a really fun job because it was completely different to some of the work that I normally do, which is the majority of games I've scored so far usually end up being in a sort of orchestral sphere, and in that it's either fully orchestral, like Killzone, the Killzone series were sort of mainly 80% orchestral and the majority of that live as well, and then 20% sort of electronica and sort of synth additives, if you will. Horizon is also a lot of acoustical elements, but very much based on soloists and then a very sort of intimate sound. Whereas this was a completely electronic production where everything is, it's just synths and drum machines. And so it's really nice to have that juxtaposition of different styles and kind of pushes you in a different direction.
Yeah, I can imagine that's fun also to do sometimes the different styles and genres.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to take a look at a different style. Talking about scoring, you just mentioned that you were scoring with the Moscow orchestra. Are you still going over there, or are other places where you go now?
Different places, yeah. So that was my first ever experience of recording with an orchestra, and my dad helped me out with preparing the parts. So. And we hadn't really worked out a method because I'd read a little bit about orchestral mock-ups, but we're talking 1999, I think, sort of 99, 2000. So people were doing orchestral mock-ups, but it wasn't sort of the thing that it is nowadays, where it's sort of very commonplace and everybody's doing it. And so I had to sort of develop a method, like how am I going to get my score? Because I can't even read music very well. I'm sort of self-taught mainly, so and so I thought, well, the first thing I got to do is basically set up my Cubase project as if it's a MIDI score, so as if it's a paper score. So woodwinds at the top, brass, percussion, strings at the bottom, choir in the middle somewhere, and then sort of find a way to translate that. And so I hadn't figured out yet that what I could do is give a MIDI file to my dad and have him imported into. We tried that, but it just became a whole big mess, and we hadn't really figured it out. So instead, we went through the very long-winded process of him sitting next to me and me basically playing different parts of the score and him transcribing it on the fly. And that's how we came up with the first score. And it was only later that I realized there's a much easier way of doing this. But that's how we did it. And it was really interesting because we went to Moscow. That in itself is a crazy experience. It's we arrived there, and initially I actually thought that my dad was the composer, so it was a bit of a shock at some point when they said, "Oh, it's actually this little kid sitting in the corner." And it was a really good learning process because I realized that my inspiration obviously was a lot of sort of the famous film scores, and I hadn't really figured out yet sort of how those things are produced and how those things are recorded. So it was really interesting trying out certain things and sort of finding out what works and what didn't work. So I had one score that was almost a bit sort of Hans Zimmerish with like a sort of very syncopated rhythm. I hadn't realized that, unless you got really good film players like in London or in LA, they're not used to those kind of rhythms because they don't necessarily appear in classical music. So they really struggled. So I had this sort of big intro leading up to this syncopated thing. And the intro was all played beautifully and very intense and very, the Russians are generally very sort of flamboyant in their playing, very romantic. And then when it got to that bit, it all became a bit, very pianissimo, like, let's just see if we can get through this without anyone noticing. And it was terrible. It was a disaster. And I also had realized that, what people like Hans Zimmer do in that instance is they just put a bunch of samples on top to make it sound as fat and epic as they can. I hadn't really, caught on to that yet. So I ended up with something that sounded great at the beginning, sounded terrible in the middle, and had an okay ending. And thankfully, that was one of the games that wasn't picked for development. So it basically all went into the trash can. So it's like, okay, great. This will go into the slightly embarrassing drawer, and we'll just put that away and keep that for some time later. And Killzone is the one that sort of had a, I think, a fairly decent main theme, and people really caught on to that, and that they played very well because it was almost in a way quite Russian. So they really knew what to do with that. And since then I've recorded in different places. So I've been to Prague, been to Los Angeles. Also was really fortunate for the second Killzone and the third one to record at Abbey Road with London players.
That works! Good job knocking out that arc tower. Attack! Alpha to respond. What the hell is going on?
Now's not really the time, sir. Come on, let's go!
And it was amazing because you get a real sense of the difference in players that you get, and how important it is to have the right players in the right space. Because it was a massive difference. Suddenly I could write the things I wanted to write and see that these players would just play it, as opposed to write something and then almost come away slightly disappointed because the players are not quite up to it. So it was a really interesting experience seeing those different things, and also knowing like, all right, if I'm going to record this, and I don't want to be too unkind to players in different areas, but you have to write to the location that you're going to record in, because otherwise you might find that they might struggle with some of the things that you've written. You go to London or Los Angeles, and they can pretty much play anything you throw at them. Yeah. But if you go somewhere else, then you really got to know the orchestra. And I had an experience similarly recently as well, where I really realized, okay, with this particular orchestra, the brass isn't quite up to it, and so next time, I should write less intense parts and be a bit more aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are. So,
yeah, I recognize the stories because I also witnessed similar problems in the past. Do you already know on beforehand where you are going to record, so you can really take the orchestra into account when you're writing?
Yeah, nowadays we do, and obviously that comes with experience, is understanding a little bit more about budgeting and players, and I've done that myself in the past, and now I have other people like either my agent or a contractor to deal with that, but. Yeah, we talk about the budget and say, right, this is how much you've got, this is how much this person's going to cost, the copying is going to cost this much, the player's going to, and so as soon as you get an inclination of the budget, you'll have an idea of where you'll be able to record it, and that's where you can compromise and say, right, maybe we'll have less players on this, but we'll be able to record it with, in London or something, where we at least will know that the studio and the players are potentially of a higher standard. And it's also really interesting is that the again, some of those realizations is that how important the room and the location you're recording. So, for example, Horizon, the first one, was recorded in a small studio called Core Studios in London. And it's a really nice sort of boutique kind of studio, but it's not a particularly big space, so it's got quite a particular sound. And then for the DLC, which is the downloadable content, so it's almost like an add-on to the original game called Frozen Wilds, we went to Air Studios, and we had the same amount of players, but it was a much bigger sound, and it was solely down to the size of the room, the acoustics in the room, and the mics that they used. And it just makes you realize that even with the same, and they were the same players, but even with a different room, how much of a difference that can make. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
Yeah, interesting story. You just mentioned it before that you were already working in the UK before you went back to the Netherlands, starting with Guerilla. Why did you decide to go to the UK? Because there was simply more a bigger game industry already over there?
Yeah, so this was really early in my career. Like I was probably about 20 years old. And at the time, in Holland, the main things that were produced there, I think there was a company called Divilex. I don't think they're around anymore.
Yes.
Who mainly did like accounting software, but then started a games division. And there was Philips CDI, which, you know, is this famous platform. And that's essentially where I got my start. So there were a couple of companies in the south of Holland producing things for Philips CDI, which is, if most people probably won't know about this platform at all. But it was essentially a precursor to CD-ROM. So it was a dedicated unit made by Philips that could play CDs with imagery on it. And it also had a very simple processing unit. And the reason I knew about this was because a lot of the people that I used to hang out with on the Atari demo scene, which is kind of where I started, you know, in my 16, you know, when I was 16, 17 years old, I was hanging out with those people. Some of those went on to be programmers on some of the Philips CDI stuff because it was the same processor chip. So they knew how to program for that chip really well. And there were a couple of companies that wanted to make games for this platform because they thought, well, this is a sort of a niche because most of it is really dull sort of, I can't even say the word now. Most of it's really dull stuff like, can't say the word. Encyclopedia. I'm trying to think of the English word.
Encyclopedia? I don't know. Encyclopedia?
Encyclopedia.
Anyway, something like that.
My English is not that good. So most of these CD-ROMs or CDIs were like reference materials.
Yes, I remember.
And or for training purposes. So it was all really dull stuff, you know. And so games was kind of a niche market, and there was some interest in that, and they were doing some interesting things there. But that was about the only game stuff that was happening in Holland. And so I worked on some of those productions, but then I realized, well, this is probably as far as it's going to go over here. And there were a couple of companies I admired in the UK, including this company called Bitmap Brothers, who were a massive deal on the Atari. They made a string of hit games, and they were incredibly popular. They were like the kings of the Atari and the Amiga. And so I thought, well, my dream at the time was to work for them. And I'd read some magazines. Obviously, this is before the advent of the internet, so there wasn't a quick way to Google someone or something. All you really had information-wise was the articles that you read in magazines. And one of these articles had a picture of them on top of a skyscraper next to a helicopter. And I thought, wow, these guys have got it made. I got to work for these guys. They make amazing games. They seem to have really got it made, and it'd be amazing to work with them. And so I didn't quite know how to reach them because there wasn't, you couldn't really find an address for them or anything. But what I did know is that every year there was almost a bit like the Games Developers Conference nowadays. There used to be a trade show called the ECTS, which was a trade show in London and London Olympia. And that was an opportunity to meet some of those developers because they were all going to be there in one place. So I sort of, I was still sort of more or less a student at the time. So I scrounged together some money to buy a ticket and I flew over there. And as it turns out, I made a mistake. I didn't end up going to the ECTS. I ended up going to something called the Future Entertainment Show, which was actually a consumer show. So it wasn't a professionals trade show. It was actually for consumers. So I arrived there, and there's all these kids coming out of buses, you know, for a little sort of fun day break. And I thought, oh, this is terrible, because they're not going to be here. This is just, you know, people selling games and stuff. And there weren't, you know, none of the developers were there. So I thought, oh, this is an absolute nightmare. But there was a panel. They did an interview panel with some of the development greats, and thankfully one of those guys from the Bitmap Brothers was there. So I waited at the side of the panel. Once they were finished, I slipped them a demo cassette, not a CD, a cassette, and didn't hear anything for 3-4 months. And then they called me up and said, "Oh, we're really interested in what you were doing, and why don't you come over?" And I did, and they hired me, and I ended up working for them for a couple of years. And it wasn't the experience I'd imagined at all. They weren't in this big skyscraper. They were in a warehouse in Docklands, in an old damp office, and it didn't have any of the glamour that I was expecting. But it was sort of a first step into game development and sort of understanding how that goes. And so in that sense, it was a good sort of teaching, you know, moment, because it's almost that thing is like, you know, you have your heroes, but don't, in a way, it's like don't make too much of it in your mind about what this could be, because the reality is never going to be as great as what you imagine it could be. And so it's good to be realistic about meeting your heroes and working with them, because it could be quite different to what you've imagined. Yeah. So I had an interesting experience. I worked on some games, but I realized that when I started working with them, that they were sort of at their end of their heyday, if you will. They were always sort of going down a bit in terms of games that they were producing. The games weren't as well received as they used to be. So I worked on one of their games, and then decided to work for another company for a while to get some more experience. And after about 3 years in London, I kind of had enough and thought I want to go back to Holland for a while, because I'm not, and that's again some of the things I learned was that I was very focused on my work at the time, so I didn't really make many connections, and that's something that I've really found out over the years that's crucial. Is it's not necessarily what you know, but it's who you know.
So that's a good tip already. And what made you decide to go back again to the UK after those years in the Netherlands?
Well, it's two reasons really. One was I sort of been working on the first Killzone and had a good experience on that, but I realized that these games take such an incredibly long time to develop that in essence, like a Killzone, for example, takes, you know, I think the first one took about between 3 and 4 years to develop. And it doesn't take 3 or 4 years to write the music for them. So I ended up filling my time with lots of other stuff, you know. So I did a lot of the sound design for it, which I quite enjoyed. But I also ended up directing some of the cutscenes with someone else. I ended up writing some of the story. I ended up, you know, doing loads of stuff that weren't really involved with music and was very interesting and very educational. But I thought I'm wasting my time here, because in the time that it takes for me to create one of those games, other composers are writing about, you know, 4 or 5 times as much music, and I want to work on a bigger diversity of projects. And I guess that's the thing that's really important to realize about working in-house versus working freelance, is that in-house you have the knowledge of knowing that you've got a steady job because you're being paid a salary. That's a very good thing to have. It gives you lots of stability. But you're kind of, you know, you're stuck with the projects that the company's doing and the amount of time that the company takes to produce those games. And that was something that after 5-6 years I thought, no, I need to have a bigger diversity. And at the end of those 5-6 years was when I did the ASCAP film scoring workshop, and I realized if I want to spread my wings a little bit, I need to get out there and start taking some risks, because it's very safe to be in this environment, and I could happily stay here for another 10 years. But as a composer, it's not challenging me enough with the variety and the diversity of projects that I can get. So, and that was the reason. Well, that, and I met my future wife, which is interesting. She was an animation producer at the time, and she was actually working for the animation company that was producing some of the animation that the game was using. And so we met and we really got on very well. And she was living in the UK. And so, yeah, it was a combination of those two things. So, yeah, love and experience was basically.
This part of Private Kitchen is also about working internationally. So one of my last questions is always, have you some tips and tricks, some do's and don'ts for composers who want to try to develop an international career instead of just staying into the Netherlands, and maybe spread out their wings and try to find some jobs and projects outside of the Netherlands?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, moving abroad obviously is one of them.
Yeah.
I think it's a great thing. Obviously now with the UK and the whole Brexit thing, it's a bit more difficult. But generally speaking, even if it's just for a short while, just to move somewhere else, and it gives you a different perspective. Like it's completely, for me, it felt very liberating because it allows you to meet a whole bunch of different people that you might not necessarily meet. With different perspectives on things. And I always felt in Holland a little bit almost hemmed in, which is kind of strange because I don't think I managed to exploit all the opportunities that might have been available to me in Holland. But it felt very liberating to go to the UK and work with, different companies within England. And funny enough, I ended up doing more work with companies in Holland than I'd done before. I ended up working with Massive Music and some Dutch developers as well. So it was quite weird. It's almost like, in some weird way, me moving to the UK afforded me some kind of credibility, I guess, that I hadn't had before, which almost, I guess, in a way made me feel more international. And still, a lot of my work still comes from Holland. All the Guerilla work is still from Holland. So, and making connections, I think, is really important. And that's the thing I really didn't realize early in my career. I was so focused on, I always thought if I do really good work, if I try my best to do the best job that I can, then my work will speak for itself. And I really found out the hard way that's not true. Because if no one knows about you, nothing's going to happen. And so, being available, meeting people, making connections, and not just connections for the sake of work, but actually human connections, So being interested in someone beyond what they have to offer you, but actually being interested in them as persons, as people, is a really important thing, because you then create friendships that might lead, they might lead to other things, but also just friendships in general that are really nice to have. So yeah, I think it's that, and it's a really hard question to answer in a way, because my career started in such a different place than other people's careers will be starting now. My career started in a time when there was no internet. There were far less games companies. So it's really hard for me to tell someone how to do it now, because I have to do it very differently now than how I used to do it. So I think another way is to look at some of the games that are out there, but also look at the modding community. So a lot of games come out, and especially on PC and sort of non-gaming platforms like PlayStation and Xbox and all those platforms are generally fairly closed. So there isn't really, people play them, but there's not much to add to them, unless it's a game that's particularly geared towards generating content. But on PCs and Macs and things like that, a lot of the content is geared towards what's called the modding, so the modifying community, where people basically, they take an original game and they are able to create levels, they're able to create almost sometimes different kinds of gameplay. And I think that's a really important community to connect with, because some of those people will often go on to actually creating, either working for companies or, it allows you in a way to get quite a bit of experience with generating a game, making a game, without necessarily having to go straight into the deep end and collaborate with people. And I think that's a really, really useful skill to have.
Well, yours, thanks a lot for all these advices. Really interesting stories you are telling, and I have the feeling you can go on for hours because
Oh, yes.
it's so much. Well, you have so much experience, of course, throughout time now, but we have to keep it short for our viewers. Well, I hope to meet you again in near future, and thanks to all our viewers, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for this.
Really nice chatting to you. Thanks, Rens.